Hello and most welcome to 1354. I will in this lecture continue with forward ideality in fragmentation by the Luxembourg-born Rodolphe Gasché. He is also famous for The Tale of the Mirror and also other books I will return to. One of my absolute favorites when it comes to interpreters of Derrida. And I will continue where I took off at page 13 in the forward still. And I'm approximately at the middle of the page where I ended at the phrase jointure. With a system, they conceive of the production of the whole, of what makes an ensemble, of pieces a whole or a totality. And this closing upon itself of an ensemble can occur, they hold, only under the form of a work, an individuality. In short, a fragment. The fragment thus captures, as one would say today, the event character of the system, of the interlinkage of the pieces of a whole. If fragmentation is thus the specifically romantic thought of the system, it is, as will become later obvious, because the production of totality is thought by them as a self-production. A self-jointure of what makes up a whole. In contradistinction from the idealist position, strictly speaking. Hegel, for instance, according to which the system consists of an ordering totally transparent to itself. The early Romantics think the system through fragmentation. That is, as presenting itself not in a pure medium of thought and in absolute figurelessness, but as always an individuality, and hence in principle multiple. But with these elaborations on the relation between the romantic fragment and the system, which we engaged in order to show that the genre of fragmentation does not, for essential reasons, exclude a coherent unity of thought. Even though this unity can be achieved only in the form of a fragment. We have also already characterized the romantic position itself. For the Romantics, the philosophy of the system is an aesthetic philosophy. For them, the ideality and absoluteness of the whole, of the totality, are thinkable only in terms of an individuality. And hence intrinsically plural unity. For them, the question of the presentability, Darstellung, of the manifolds gathering into one remains an irreducible question. In this sense, the Romantics are closer to Kant than to the idealists. With whom they share their theoretical concerns. It is this insistence of the question of the presentation of what unifies that has led them to seek the unity of thought in art. Art, indeed, stands for the irreducibility of presentation. If beauty becomes the unifying idea by which all the Kantian oppositions become sublated, this sublation takes place in the realm of the Darstellung itself. It takes place in an aesthetic speculation that yields to become a work of art itself. And in which philosophy accomplishes itself as art. Within the landscape of idealism in general, the very possibility that the unifying idea can seek presentation as beautiful idea. And that unification, hence, is always necessarily aesthetic, sensible, and manifold. In other words, fragmentary. This is what constitutes the romantic vision and demarcates it from the idealism of Fichte and Hegel. As well as from the poetry of Hölderlin. In the literary absolute, Lacoue-Labarthe and Nancy hold that although Schlegel had been forced to abandon the term fragment by other members of the group, the fragments entitled Ideas, published in 1800 in the Athenaeum, are engaged from a philosophical point of view in the deepening of the concept of the fragment. Indeed, even if the fragments of the ideas are no longer fragments, strictly speaking, in that they are not written collectively and have a unifying title. They further deepen, as the authors put it. The idea of the subject, that is, of self-conception and self-production as an interminable process. What is an idea for Schlegel in the first place? In Athenaeum fragment 121, he writes, "An idea is a concept perfected to the point of irony. An absolute synthesis of absolute antithesis. the continual self-creating interchange of two conflicting thoughts. In an idea, synthesis of opposites occurs. They lose their individuality and dissolve in it. An idea, therefore, is, in the same way as a work, formed. Everywhere sharply delimited. But within those limits, limitless and inexhaustible. But the idea is a synthetic concept, perfected to the point of irony, Schlegel insists. That is to refer to the aforementioned fragment once again. A concept that, in spite of its faithfulness to itself and homogeneity, is nonetheless exalted above itself. An idea, consequently, continuously transcends the synthesis or sublation that it achieves. It is destructive of the form of the idea itself, as not fully adequate to its concept. An idea that unifies and brings into infinite interchange two absolutely antithetical thoughts is always only a self-presentation of the idea as such, and must therefore ironically destroy its own actualization. If ideas are called infinite, independent, unceasingly moving, godlike thoughts, the idea of God being the idea of ideas, it is in order to point not only to the continual interchange of what is sublated in the idea, but to one infinite strife of the idea to approximate itself. To make idea and its presentation alike. Although Schlegel was a lifelong avid reader of Plato, such an understanding of idea as infinitely inappropriate to its own self-presentation. Does not belong to the order of the proteronte physi, nor is the Schlegelian concept of idea to be assimilated with a speculative idea, that is, the idea as the unity of the ideal and the real. As Lacoue-Labarthe and Nancy put it, the idealistic step has been effectuated in the motive of infinitization. But not without a kind of obscure resistance to idealism itself. Or more precisely, not without a sort of folding back of idealism into Kant. And of the transgression of finitude into the finite itself. The romantic notion of the idea is, indeed, more Kantian than Platonic or idealist. And if between fragment and idea there is a close connection, it is certainly appropriate to inquire. However briefly, into Kant's theory of the idea. As Kant readily acknowledges in Critique of Pure Reason, his own use of the term idea with which Plato designated something which not only can never be borrowed from the senses, but far surpasses even the concepts of understanding. Inasmuch as in experience nothing is ever to be met with that is coincident with it. Is dependent on Plato, but only as far as the spirit of Plato's doctrine of the ideas is concerned. By following Plato's intentions, rather than certain things he explicitly said about the ideas. Kant, in developing his own concept of the idea, claims to have understood Plato better than he has understood himself. But what then are ideas in the Kantian sense? In very general terms, they are concepts of reason to which no corresponding object can be given in sensation, and which therefore can only be approximated in an infinite process. Such a dictionary definition, however, does not allow us to grasp the specificity and range of Kant's concept of idea. It certainly does little to disarm the popular opinion that, however defined, ideas are only ideas. In other words, superfluous and void. To show that ideas, in the Kantian sense, represent a valid problematic and, indeed, one that flows from Kant's and much of the tradition's conception that the activities of the mind are primarily judgmental activities. I can't refrain from comment there. What a sad situation. End of my comment. I turn to his discussion on the notion of idea in Critique of Pure Reason. More precisely to the first book of the Transcendental Dialectic. As Kant's elaborations in the context of the first critique on the formal, that is, logical function of reason under the form of the syllogism. Demonstrate. Universal concepts that do not originate in understanding, but that depend on thought alone, serve as principles of sorts to provide unity to the manifold judgmental acts of understanding. But that depend on thought alone, serve as principles to provide unity to the manifold judgmental acts of understanding. Through the syllogism and its universal concepts, reason, or pure thought for that matter, gives a unity to knowledge, i.e., that is, to the manifold of cognitive judgments that is called the unity of reason, and which is quite different in kind from any unity that can be accomplished by the understanding. Reason achieves such unification of the manifold of understanding through the a priori synthetic principles and rules that it spontaneously formulates. My comment here is that order comes by itself in the Kantian system, or any system that is, as in this text, called judgmental, observer, dependent, and a posteriori. End of comment. They represent a knowledge on the basis of concepts alone, and that is implied in the very acts of judgments of knowledge. So I go back a little bit. Reason achieves such unification of the manifold of understanding through the a priori synthetic principles and rules that it spontaneously formulates. They represent a knowledge on the basis of concepts alone, and that is implied in the very acts of judgments of knowledge. it is the a priori knowledge of the unconditioned of the whole series of conditions, synthetic knowledge in short. Kant calls these universal synthetic concepts that accompany all our intellectual efforts to understand phenomena, ideas. As opposed to the pure concepts of understanding, which contain nothing more than the unity of reflection upon appearances, insofar as appearances must necessarily belong to a possible empirical consciousness. The ideas or concepts of reason contain the unconditioned to which all experience is subordinate, yet which itself can never be an object of experience, and which must be obtained by mere reflection. On acts of cognitive judgments, and nota bene, the word judgment is at the core of this. The transcendental concepts of reason, the ideas, are, writes Kant, none other than the concepts of the totality of the conditions for any given conditioned. That is, the unconditioned or the ground of the synthesis of the conditioned. They are concepts of the totality in the synthesis of conditions. Of the allness, universitas, or totality of the conditions. They are concepts of the totality in the synthesis of conditions, of the allness, universitas, or totality of the conditions, or as he also calls it, the absolute. Kant has a very intricate system that closes up on itself, and big hint here is the word judgment. ideas for Kant and the Romantics were judgments. They were not something new, and they are almost an effect of an automatic process. In the very system keenly and strictly outlined by Kant, all sorts of judgments are fixated, so to speak. First, divided in a priori and a posteriori. The a priori is before experience, the categories which without nothing could be understood. The a posteriori is after experience. This division is in itself divided into two different levels. First level is analytic, and that means that analytic means that they are unchangeable. Analytic is very close to a sort of machinery. Think in terms of logic. You have to do the work, but they were always already decided. We will all come to the same conclusion, no matter in what time or in what circumstances we are doing it, as long as we haven't done it. Synthetic truths are a lot of work that has to be done, and the results are not given beforehand in the same way. Oddly enough, this is an interesting thing. Kant placed mathematics in the a priori synthetical. So it was given beforehand, but you have to do the work, so to speak. So mathematics is in a way half decided. But you see here, everything becomes not only divided in space. This is literally a divided, fragmented division, but also in time. This is what a priori does in contradistinction to a posteriori. And it makes the past unchangeable. So you can see how this parallels eternal laws, and you can also see what direction it takes of determining, deciding, making something an end in itself. It's a finished product before you even try it out, and you will never ever know the difference. You're already in the system. It's a locking mechanism. I think these tendencies developed simultaneously in a togetherness. People of the art, the era, and the philosophers together. It was of the time of fragmentization, both in philosophy and in the arts and in all other aspects. And it became something to appreciate, like being appreciation of one's own cage. Coming to like it, put it to the skies and saying, this is something to strive for. And obviously Kant had a lot of that effect, stirring and pushing the process even further. But it's very important, he was not the sole reason. There is a togetherness. This is what Rodolphe Gasché so eloquently takes up in the article. We see how the poets appreciate it, affect it, affected by it, raise it to the skies, making it the model to be achieved, concluding why it's correct, making themselves right. I think if our unsung hero Edward de Bono were to partake in the writings of Kant, he would have found even more clear and modern material than when he was looking into Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. It is the very definition of the idea that the truth is already out there, and claiming directly without hesitance that ideas somewhere in a Platonic but more complicated, I'd say more modern way, always have been there, and there is nothing new under the sky. Very good.
Hello, hello. So, the Romantics, they didn't like the word fragment, so they forced Schlegel to change it to idea. But Schlegel tried to save the word instead, so he gave his definition of it anyhow. And perhaps it's a tendency of renaming things from fragment to idea and vice versa. And how did Schlegel define all an idea? Schlegel and Kant define idea. It's Schlegel defined it as a synthesis of opposites. Okay, and and it's interesting that Kant thought that ideas are judgments. That's an important point. So let's compare with Plato's concept of idea. So for Plato, a table is a table. Far enough. But for Kant, there would be like a bad table and good table. So there are judgments at once. Although perhaps also for Plato there is, I don't know, he didn't have that kind of moral judgment. If he put it simply, the comparison in simple terms. But I would like to ask you something, Hans, when you mentioned a priori and posteriori, is there what is more healthy, a priori or posteriori, or neither of them is healthy, so to say? How should we think about these two terms and try to put it in simple terms?
Well, I say in Kant, and this is why I would have wanted our beloved friend or hero, our unsung hero, Edward Bono, to have read Kant. because a priori and a posteriori work together to sort of lock the whole world. So it's after that it's unmovable. You cover both a priori, with that you cover the past. A posteriori you cover the future. This becomes a lockdown in the first level, and in the second level with analytic, the first, and synthetic, you lock also space. It's a complete lockdown. Possibly, and it's an idea I got now, this could also be helpful to explain the renaming principle that Kalle named here. Once you are in the lockdown, you will continue the process of the understanding that everything is sort of terminated, finished. Something that resonates with the late 18th century perception of the world being finished, which is called the big boredom. Nothing new under the sun. And this goes for the modern tendency of renaming. Once you are in the locked system, what can you do? There can be no progression in understanding in the Kantian system, or very, very little. That will have to take place in the synthetic area, which is narrow. In the end, you can only, it is like you always already been in this system. That will be your world, and it is tremendously clear that these people can't get out of it. What can they do? They can only rename. A thing that oddly also took place in physics. The renaming went all the way to quantum physics when the whole structure collapsed. But to this day, in academia, renaming is the only progression. And you are only at liberty to possibly change the borders of synthetic or non-synthetic or a priori, push them a little bit, make a new area and rename that. Can you imagine the limitation? This is something that Gasché, in the Tale of the Mirror, a marvelous book made by him, called nullification. You only have one piece of bread, you divide it in two and say you have two pieces of bread. But there is no gain. And I was also say that there is nothing new here. It is the same bread. You only have the very limited choice to decide where to cut it up. But once you're in it, this is an excellent way of understanding what it is to be inside, not knowing anything else, and also appreciating it. When I was sitting here, I came with an idea. It doesn't perfectly fit the theme today, but it fits what it is to be in the Newtonian paradigm perfectly. When I was looking out, I observed a bird. It has flown away. It was a crow, and we now have winter time. And if somebody were to ask me, or I would say anybody else, do Swedish crows fly away to southern places to find better pastures and food alternatives? I would say no. They're still here, and apparently, without doubt, that roof had been in the possession of the crow for a pretty long time. It was obvious it was his turf, his territory. And I thought so until 10 years ago. I'm pretty sure that my parents and my grandparents would say, the crows, they stay all winter. They're permanently here. This turned out not to be true. This is how it works. This is the real world. One thing that is impossible to discover, as poor Schlegel and Fichte couldn't either, nor Kant, as long as you're inside of it. This is what happens. The Swedish crows fly away, but they get replaced with other crows. And this happens smoothly, without it hardly being noticeable. I saw it for the first time in my life this year. I parked my car one area and it was hundreds of crows. They were tired. They'd been flying for a very long time. They came to take the place of the Swedish crows. Unless you've seen that, which is a rare experience, or as in my case, I was informed by an awful, a bird watcher, saving myself from pronouncing the word, you will not know the difference. So you are in the system and you build your system from your experience. For I experienced them to be the same. Afterwards, I did notice differences. The crows in wintertime, they are slightly larger. They are a little bit bigger. I could not see that until someone opened my eyes. That it is like to be in the Kantian lockdown system. It covers all strands of experience, and you can only divide what's been limited by the history of knowledge, I would call it. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.